Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. Stephanie replays some games and stuff, so how about we try some Streets of Rage 2 today for the Sega Genesis. Alright, so I haven't played this game in forever, so bear with me. I do not remember the controls or anything. Gotta program the keys real quick. There we go. Press start button. Options, level. Let's try normal. Maximum lives it gives me 5. And it doesn't let me customize the controls, so oh dear. Of course, Blaze. Stage 1, here we go. I played a lot of Streets of Rage 2 when I was a kid. I did not own this game. There we go. But one of my friends did, so I used to go to his house to play all the time. He was one of my friends that had a Sega Genesis and a Super Nintendo. But because his parents were divorced, he had the Genesis at his dad's house where he spent his weekdays for school. And then he kept his Super Nintendo at his mom's house, I believe it was, where he was on the weekends, something like that. So, I didn't get to play his Super Nintendo, but here's the thing, back then, I had 5 friends that I hung out with regularly. Treff, Daniel, Patrick, Jacob, and Michael. Those were my friends. Treff had a Sega Genesis at his house, like I mentioned, and a Super Nintendo at his mom's house on the weekends. Daniel had a Windows PC, Windows 3.1, I believe, with computer games, no consoles. Patrick had an SNES and an Atari Jaguar, which we used to make fun of him for having, but he would let us play when we went to his house. He lived out in the country, so we weren't able to go out there very often. Because his parents lived on a farm, and they didn't like him having company for some reason. Jacob was like me. He had a Genesis, I had a Genesis and an NES. And then Michael only had an NES. He had nothing newer than that. So, when I went to Daniel's house, and we did play games, it was usually Legend, it was Eye of the Beholder 2, Legend of Dark Moon was the game we played. Also Duke Nukem. Not Duke Nukem 3D, it wasn't out yet. The side-scrolling Duke Nukem from Apogee is the one we played. Is there a jump button? There we go. And, so that was the game we played at his house. Ah, yeah, knife. Give it to me. And then, when I hung out at Michael's house, he had the NES. So, the big game he had that we liked to play was Legend of Zelda, or Zelda 2 Adventure of Link, I should say. No, 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 no! I'm gonna die. Give me that knife back. I think I went too far. I don't know if I can break these. When we went to Patrick's house, we didn't really play video games that often. We would mostly play Dungeons & Dragons, or the Dragon board game, because that was what he was into. He's the friend that got me into him and Daniel are the two friends that got me into Dungeons & Dragons. Jacob had a fucking shit ton of Sega games. Like, he had all the good games. And Treff's parents were not rich by rich people standards, but rich compared to us. He had, like, all the toys, all the video games, all the Nerf guns, and Super Soakers, and all that cool stuff. He had way more toys than anybody I knew. And, yeah. So we played a lot of Sega games at Trev's house. We mostly played this one. We played the Mortal Kombat 1 and 2 because he had those. We played the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers video game, which I'm definitely going to be playing at some point. And then we also played the X-Men video game, which I'm also going to be playing at some point. That one might be tricky because I don't know how to turn off the second controller on this thing, so it's gonna default to 2 players. So I have to figure out how to do that still. So I might not be able to play that game yet. Oh my god, this guy's pissing me off. Can you just... Here. There we go. Sacrifice some of my life to get rid of him, because he is giving me a headache. I can't remember whatever other games we played at his house. So many fucking video games. But he also had toys, so we used to play with his toys. He had all the Power Ranger Zords. He had all the Exo Squad E-frames. He had a shit ton of Transformers and Ninja Turtles. So Streets of Rage 2 is one of those games. Remember, back in the 90s when this game came out, Sega was still kings of the arcades. I mean, if an arcade game existed and it was hot, it was probably Sega, Capcom, or Konami. Some of them were Namco, but Sega, Konami, and Capcom were the big 3, you know. Midway was also pretty big with Mortal Kombat and a couple other games. They had NBA Jam at the time, which is another game we played the shit out of. So, most of your Sega Genesis games came in 2 flavors. They were either ports of games Sega had already released in the arcade, and they were pretty good, all things considered, arcade ports. You know, they were not pixel perfect, but nothing was back then. We didn't expect them to be, but they were goddamn good enough. And then the second type of game they had were games they made for the Genesis, which were mostly games designed to fill a hole in the library to match what Nintendo was doing. So they were like side-scrolling platformers, puzzle games, stuff like that. Basically just whatever Nintendo did, they had something to counter it. Sonic to counter Mario, Columns to counter Tetris, Vector Man to counter Donkey Kong Country. This game, the Streets of Rage series, was actually different. Oh, and Phantasy Star to counter Final Fantasy. I forgot to mention. Yeah, stuff like that. So, if whatever was big on Nintendo, Sega tried to have an equivalent on the Genesis. Something comparable. Third-party companies generally were either equal. They would make a game for both systems because they were both popular, or they would make a game exclusive for Genesis, or make the Genesis version the better version, usually, because the Genesis, for the most part, for the majority of its existence, dominated the SNES. People forget that. And Nintendo had their restrictive policies that third-party companies were trying to get away from. So you still had companies like, you know, Capcom and Namco and Konami who were, you know, flooding the SNES with their games. But everybody else had pretty much shifted to Genesis. And then after Genesis went away, they would just migrate to PlayStation and leave Nintendo in the dust. And that's more or less been the case ever since. Streets of Rage, let's get back to that for a second, was actually Sega's answer to Capcom's Final Fight. And when it was talked about in the magazines, they didn't call it a beat-em-up back then. The magazines all called it a, quote, Final Fight type game is what they referred to it as. Even though Final Fight was more basically a Double Dragon clone. Nobody called them Double Dragon type games. It was weird. The magazines didn't always make sense. But some of the magazines, like Sega Visions, didn't call them beat-em-ups either because that term didn't exist yet. They called them fighting games. Just fighting games. Because Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, you know, the one-on-one fighting games hadn't really become a thing yet. It was actually Jeff Rovine who coined the term beat 'em up in his How to Win at Nintendo Games books. He classified Double Dragon as a beat 'em up, and then he also, I think, coined the term shoot 'em up. Those were his terms, I believe. And then when the internet came to prominence, those were the terms that were retroactively applied to these types of games. Back in the day, we just called shooting games. We didn't call them shoot 'em ups or shmups. That term didn't exist. And we didn't call these beat 'em ups. We just called them brawlers, Final Fight type games, or fighting games. After Street Fighter 2 became a big hit and Mortal Kombat became a big hit, the term fighting game was then applied to one-on-one fighting games, which we previously called martial arts games. I know it's confusing, but the 90s were a different time than today. Can you get off the damn bike, please? Jesus, he's pissing me off. Now, I'm gonna go ahead and say I'm sure there are people out there that remember calling them those terms back then, but I read the magazine. I read all the magazines. Those were not the terms the magazines used, and those were not the terms me and my friends used, so that's the basis of what I know, obviously. I moved a lot and didn't live in one town, so I had a pretty broad range of experiences. So I would say my experiences are pretty reflective of the culture at the time, or at least Midwest culture at the time, I will clarify. So I can't say for certain nobody was using the term beat 'em up back then, but it wasn't the standard term it is today. It wasn't universal. Like today when you say beat 'em up, you think of this game, you think of Double Dragon, Final Fight. Those are the games you think of. For a lot of people, this is the first game that pops in their head. Rightly so, because it's one of the best beat 'em ups ever. And by far, this is the best Streets of Rage game. And you'll notice briefly in the intro when I was in the select screen before I started the game, there was an option for duel. So even though this is a side-scrolling fighting game, we'll call it, according to the conventions of the time, it also had the duel mode, which basically was a Street Fighter 2 type fighting game mode, which lets you pick from the characters and play a more modern, at the time, one-on-one fighting game. So that's another one of the reasons why this one is considered the best, because it's actually 2 games in one. But the duel mode, I believe, is only a 2-player mode, so I don't really have any way to play it right now to show it to you. I believe, but I don't remember 100%. That's just how we always played, so I don't remember, but Right now, I'm having fun with this. Let's go ahead and knock these motherfuckers out. Come on, Donovan. Die, die, die. Money bags. Oh, also, I forgot to mention, just like I said yesterday with Shinobi 3, this is another one of those games that's built on arcade gaming conventions, so you'll notice I have points next to my name. And everything I do gives me points. Again, the primary goal is obviously get to the end, beat the game. Rescue whoever was kidnapped. The secondary goal is obviously get the high score. Today, which I really hate YouTube for this, gamers don't try to get the high score anymore. So when you search high score, X game high score, you don't get people playing the game for the high score. You get assholes who are speedrunning because YouTube hears the word high score and it interprets it as speedrun. I hate that. I hate speedruns. I don't hate all speedruns. I do watch games done quick. Oh my god, I don't like this guy. The music changed, so I'm assuming this is a boss. Or a mini-boss. Yep, mini-boss. And I can't hit him because he's in the sky, and I can't get on his plane. This is gonna be hard. I can't even hit him. I can't even hit him. Shit. God damn it. How am I supposed to fucking fight someone I can't hit? There we go. Fuck me. I don't know what I'm supposed to do if I can't hit the motherfucker. I hate this boss. I do not remember how to beat him. Obviously, my strategy of jump kicking isn't working because I can't even... There we go. Ah, I don't like this. I'm not going to beat this boss, probably. Son of a bitch. Ah! Missed. Damn it, that was a waste of energy. He doesn't have a lot of health, but it's just real hard to hit him. I've already lost 2 lives on this motherfucker. I don't like this. I hope this isn't one of those games where the sub-boss comes back later as a regular enemy. They do that a lot in these types of games. There we go. Holy shit balls. Oh, he better be dead. Stage 2 clear. Here we go. My hand fell asleep. Wiggle my fingers in between levels. See if I can wake my fingers up. I gotta pause the game for a minute. My fingers fell asleep. I can't play the game when my hand is asleep. Let me see if I can get some movement. Get some blood back in my hands. Oh, man. Alright. I'll just play with numb fingers, I guess. I don't need my fingers, I just need my thumb. Give me that bar. Give me that bar. Thank you. Food? Nope. No, I want the bar. Bar has range. And hits hard. Yeah, there's the food. Don't need it right now, but I'll take it. They always give you the food when you don't need it. I hate that. It's like, give it to me right before I go into the boss. That's useful. Give it to me after the second bad guy of the level. That's not helpful. How bad do you think I am at this game? Goddamn. Ooh. Bare Knuckle. Bare Knuckle is what Streets of Rage was known as in Japan, by the way. I don't know about Europe, I apologize. I don't know that much about the European Mega Drive market. All I know is it was called Mega Drive. Basically, it was Mega Drive everywhere but the US in North America. Only in North America was it called Genesis. And that's because Sega executives, rightfully so, thought that if they called it Genesis, Americans would associate it with the Bible and think it was okay to play. Also, Sega was very big. If you had a Genesis Model 1 or Model 2, it had a very prominent Made in America sticker on the bottom, which was another big deal to Americans at the time, because they saw Nintendo as a Japanese company that was, quote, invading America. Even though Sega is also technically a Japanese company, they were able to trick people into thinking they were an American company, partially because they technically were an American company who relocated to Japan. They were actually established by a couple of American soldiers in the 1950s after World War II, who went over to Japan to build arcade machines because soldiers had so much fun playing arcade machines when they were on base. That's the history of how Sega, originally, because of their ties to the military, they were called service games. That's what Sega stands for, service games. A lot of people don't know that. But they eventually sold their assets to a Japanese investor who renamed the game Sega, S-E-G-A, which took the S-E from service and G-A from games, service games, and shortened it to Sega to make it sound more Japanese. Because they wanted to be successful in Japan, and they were just as xenophobic about American stuff as Americans were xenophobic about Japanese stuff. It was a different time, you know. Which is funny because they renamed the company Sega to sound more Japanese, but Americans mistook it for the more, quote, American company because it didn't sound Japanese. So it's kind of weird. Like I said, marketing is funny. I studied a little bit of marketing in college. I took a lot of marketing classes because it was part of my degree. Because I studied communications. And marketing is a big part of communications. Obviously, advertising is like, you know, the business side of communications. And so, they also made us take classes in sociology and psychology. Because believe it or not, you probably know this, marketing experts and advertisers do study psychology. Because they use that to entice you. They heavily use psychological principles in marketing, especially to teenagers and women. They prey on teenagers and women because they're both not gullible but susceptible marketing demographics, I should say. Marketing to men is basically just put a beautiful woman in the commercial and they'll buy whatever you tell them to. Men are easy. They don't require psychology at all. They think with their dicks. Which is why everything targeting men always has a beautiful woman in the commercial. This is one of the ones I talked about. She had previously been a sub-boss, and now she's just a normal enemy. They do that a lot in these games. Where you'll fight a boss on one level, and they'll come back a few levels later as just a regular enemy. But they're still just as hard as they were as a boss. That is that's how they ramp up the difficulty. Then you have enemies like this that have multiple life bars, which is frustrating. And this jerk has multiple knives because he's thrown knives at me, but he still has knives. I knew he was going to get me because I'm not on his plane and my punches are missing him. God damn it. I got to get away from him, and I can't. Take that, motherfucker. My fingers are completely numb. I can't feel my fingers at all. I have to pause the game for a second. I've got to pause. I can't feel shit in my hand. My hand is asleep. I just gotta let my hand wake up. I don't know why that happens. Oh, my whole left arm is falling asleep. My entire arm is falling asleep. It must be a circulation problem. It must be because my cat is sitting on my side. He must be cutting off the blood. Sorry, buddy. There we go. I'm getting feeling back in my hands now. So, true story. And this is actually not only a true story, this is an amazing fact. Sega is the only video game company in existence that is still in their original industry. They started out as an arcade company, then they've always been an arcade company. Nintendo started out as a playing card company, then a toy company, and then a video game company. Sony started out as an electronics company, and then a multimedia company, and then a video game company. Microsoft started out as a software company, and then a video game company. Everybody else, Mattel, who started in television, Atari, Atari was started as a video game company, but then they became sort of a technology company. Today, they're more of a brand than they are a company. It's weird. But Atari doesn't make arcade machines anymore, and that's what they started out doing. Their first video game was an arcade machine. So even Atari, who often gets credit incorrectly, but often credited with inventing video games, isn't in the same business they were when they started. But Sega still is. And they're literally the only one out of all the video game companies that used to make hardware, I should say. Obviously, there are third-party software companies that started out as third-party software companies that are still third-party software companies. I just mean the ones that made hardware. Atari, Sega, Nintendo, Microsoft, etc. Sega's the only one that is still in the same business they started as. Because home video games was not Sega's business. Arcades were. Home video games was just a side project they did to expand their business. When the home video game market began to threaten their business, they left and went back to arcades only, and then occasionally dabble in home video game releases, like Persona games and Sonic the Hedgehog games. But to this day, their core business is still arcade machines, mostly casino machines, to be fair. But still, coin-operated electronics. This is a weird, out-of-place sci-fi alien-type level, smack dab in the middle of a grounded, realistic, New York-based beat-em-up, which is another reason why it's a fan favorite. Because this alien thing here literally doesn't come back, it is not the big boss, and it has nothing to do with the story. It's just a random, out-of-place sci-fi reference in the middle of a video game that has nothing to do with sci-fi stuff. Which is weird. I assume this is a response to the Aliens games, because Alien vs. Predator was a popular arcade beat-em-up at the time this game was out. So this is probably sort of a reference to that, I would imagine. Alright. I missed. Shit. I missed again! Oh, that's not good. There we go. And that's not even the level boss. It's just a mid-level piece of shit distraction. Oh god! A ninja! I forgot this game had ninjas. Wow, they really are stepping up the difficulty. Again, a reference to Alien. We have eggs. And now we have a guy that looks like Blanca from Street Fighter. Which again was another popular fighting game at the time. Sega does that a lot with their games. They actually make a lot of references to sci-fi stuff in their games. The original Shinobi game actually has Spider-Man as one of the level bosses. He was removed from subsequent releases because, you know, Marvel said, hey, no. Alright, enough with that hip-hop shit. Get over here and let me kick your ass. Motherfucker. What makes you think you have a right to fucking live? Huh? Asshole? Time to fucking die. Get over here and die. He's also got the Freddy Krueger glove, which I guess is kind of a reference to either Samurai Showdown, where a character very similar in design to this guy has a Freddy Krueger glove, or Vega, also from Street Fighter, it's possible. Or both. It also looks like he has some sort of mask on his face, too. Could be a reference to Jason, I don't know. Obviously, I wasn't in the boardroom when the creatives were designing this game. Stage 4! I believe there's only 5 stages in this game, but I'm not 100%. That's the thing. This game is based on an arcade philosophy, so it's like pretty short, all things considered. But the levels get harder because arcade games were designed to eat your quarters, but they weren't like terribly long because the idea was if you put enough quarters in them, you should theoretically be able to beat them. They're basically pay-to-play, pay-to-win games. Give me that damn pipe. I need my lead pipe. Colonel Mustard is in the library, and I gotta go knock his ass the fuck out. Do baseball. I love it. Japanese people love their baseball. Sega actually makes some of the best baseball video games ever. I'm kind of surprised that they don't make baseball games today. They really dropped the ball on that one. They actually used to make the best sports games, better than EA. But their company, true story, they were the ones that made 2K games. Those were Sega. That was Sega games. That was Sega Sports. They sold it when they left the hardware business and they were desperate for cash. When they discontinued the Dreamcast, they sold off their sports division, and it was Take-Two that bought it. And that's why we have Take-Two making 2K games today instead of Sega. But they actually used to be made by Sega. Over the years, Sega sold off a lot of their assets. You know, they had to stay in business somehow. And the 90s were not a bad time. The early 90s were a great time for Sega. The mid to late 90s were a bad time for Sega. They just bit off more than they can chew. The Genesis got mega popular, mega fast Hint, Mega Drive, LOL. But, God damn it, I gotta get him off me! But, the market got crowded starting in 93. And then it just got even more crowded as the decade went on. Because in 93, in addition to the SNES, the CDI, and the Sega Genesis, and the Sega CD, which were all already on the market, and the Neo Geo, 93 introduced the 3DO, and the Atari Jaguar, and the Jaguar CD. 94 would introduce the 32X, the Neo Geo CD, in Japan, the Saturn and PlayStation, worldwide in 95. In 95, they would also introduce the Nomad. Excuse me. The Nomad. While they still had the Game Gear on the market. And a Nintendo would introduce in 95 the Virtual Boy, which was a very short-lived product. In 96, Nintendo would introduce the Nintendo 64, originally called Project Reality, renamed Ultra 64, and then they renamed it just before, literally days before launch, weeks before launch, they renamed it the Nintendo 64. Because they realized that they had their name in both of their previous hardwares, and they didn't have their name in the N64. And so they thought, well, we have to have our name in the machine or people won't know it's ours for whatever reason. Because, you know, that goes back to marketing and branding. Obviously, calling it the Nintendo 64 gave us the shorthand N64, which is what most people refer to it as. If it had been the Ultra 64, I don't know what we would have called it for shorthand. Ah, I hate this guy, Big Ben. You'll notice I'm in a baseball stadium. Like a minute ago, I was talking about the posters that said "Do Baseball." Now I'm in a baseball stadium. I think that's pretty cool. This game is very 90s in its music, its presentation, the bad guy's clothes. This is a very 90s game. I died. I'm just gonna hit. Continue. I have 2 continues. Obviously, I'm going to stay as Blaze. Actually, I don't remember how many stages this game has. I thought it was 5, but it might be 7. It might be more than that. I don't remember. I'm going to be honest. I haven't played it in fucking ever. I don't remember this part at all, so I don't know if I ever got this far, to tell you the truth. None of this looks that familiar. Every beat-em-up at the time had this little elevator stage that took you to, usually, the final stage. It was a common trope at the time. My hand is falling asleep again. Ah! Big old dude. What's his name? I don't know how to say that. Yato? Gotta get him off me, they're gonna beat me up. Oh my god, they just dropped a whole screen full of bad guys on me. Now, one thing you may have noticed by now is even though they are pretty detailed sprites, the characters, they've got pretty limited movement. They all basically have like 1 or 2 moves and that's it. Not a ton of animation, but pretty good sprite movement, all things considered, for the time, again. Would have been nice to see what a Streets of Rage game could have looked like on the Saturn, but for some reason, Sega didn't do that. Sega had a philosophy at the time where they didn't believe in franchises. So any game that they made for the Master System was, by and large, left on the Master System. They created all new franchises for the Genesis, and they did the same thing with the Saturn. They did not want to make a Sonic game for the Saturn. They wanted Saturn to have its own mascot because their business practice at the time, each console had its own mascot. The Master System's mascot was Alex Kidd. The Genesis, Sonic was supposed to be the Genesis mascot, not the company mascot. Which is why there was no initial Sonic the Hedgehog game for the Saturn. Because there wasn't going to be. Which is also why there's no Sonic the Hedgehog game for the 32X. Because the 32X is basically a Saturn in a box that you plug into your Genesis, more or less. This guy looks like Ultimate Warrior from the wrestling days. So yeah. So when Sega realized that Sonic, because they had the animated show, they had two animated shows, Sonic the Hedgehog and the Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog, and then they also had the Archie Comics series. Sega realized that, I don't have enough life to do the power move. Oops. And he's still on gray bar, so I haven't even got him to the yellow bar yet. Sega realized that, maybe Sonic is our mascot. And so they took a game that they had created for the Genesis, Sonic 3D Blast, and they just enhanced the graphics a little bit, created a new 3D special stage, and basically just plopped it on the Saturn, gave it no effort at all. And then they started development on a game called Sonic X, which was going to be a proper 3D Sonic platformer. But due to lack of sales on the Saturn, rising costs, and everything else, they migrated the game over to the Katana, which was their in development next generation console. And when they released Katana to the public as Dreamcast, that game was retooled into what we now know as Sonic Adventure. Parts of it were used in Sonic R on the Sega Saturn because they just desperately needed to get a game out. So they actually did use assets from Sonic X to cobble together Sonic R, which if you've played Sonic R, you can tell they threw that game together in basically like 4 or 5 months. It was not a game that they sat out to make. It was something they just said, oh shit, we need a Sonic game, like right the fuck now, what can we do? Well, let's make a foot racing game, I guess. And that's where Sonic R comes from. One of the problems with Sega at the time is they actually were two companies. They were Sega of America and Sega of Japan. Now, they weren't... So, Nintendo has Nintendo Company Limited, which we refer to as Nintendo of Japan, but it's actually NCL. And they have Nintendo of America, which is a subsidiary. Nintendo of America is a wholly owned subsidiary, but Nintendo treats it as a branch office of NCL. They do not treat it like its own independent company. That is not how Sega operated. Sega basically let Sega of Japan exist on its own, and Sega of America exist on its own. And so the two companies didn't get along because they let Tom Kalinske do what he wanted in North America. They said, here you go. They handed him the keys to the Cadillac and said, go, make us money, and let him do what he wanted. But the problem was, the problem was twofold. A lot of it was pride, Japanese pride. Because in Japan, the Mega Drive was a flop. It was successful in Europe. It was fucking phenomenally successful in North America, primarily USA. And incredibly, unbelievably successful in Brazil. But it was a dud in Japan. The TurboGrafx 16, which never even got released worldwide, which was only available in Japan as the PC Engine, and briefly in the US as the TurboGrafx, was more popular in Japan than the Mega Drive. Also, the SNES was, or the Super Famicom, I should say, was more popular in Japan. And when the PlayStation came out, it was lighting up the sales charts. But let's backtrack before PlayStation. At the time, Sega of Japan was pissed off that a product they designed was doing better in the overseas market than it was in their home market. And so they were desperate to bury the Genesis as quick, or the Mega Drive in Japan, as quick as they could and get the Saturn to market. Now what happened was, Sega of America actually wanted to work with Sony. Because Sony wanted Sega to make the PlayStation. They didn't want to do it themselves. Sega of Japan said no. So then, Sega of America designed their own home console to replace the Genesis based on the Model 1 hardware. But because they were getting wind of what Sony was planning to do with PlayStation, Sega of Japan designed their own hardware based on the Model 2 arcade board, which was a little bit more powerful. Sega compromised. They agreed to modify the Sega of America console and release it as an add-on to the Genesis, the 32X. And then they were going to release Saturn later. And then the plan was, once 32X got its footing in the North American market and Saturn got its footing in the Japanese market, the plan was they would release a hybrid system that had the 32X hardware and the Genesis hardware built in instead of making it an upgrade, and that was going to be known as the Mars. The Mars never happened. Also, because the Sega CD was struggling, Sega redesigned the Sega CD into a portable unit known as the CD-X, which also failed to catch on. And so again, Sega had too many products on the market at the time, not enough game studios to support them all, not enough money to market them all, and they weren't getting enough sales to justify all of them being on the market in the first place. And so they discontinued the Genesis prematurely to throw all their resources at the Saturn, which was a failure, realized they made a mistake, and then reopened Genesis development after it was too late, and they partnered with Jaleco, who created the Genesis 3 redesign. But by that time, the damage was done. The Genesis market was over. Genesis gamers had migrated to PlayStation, and they never came back. They never came back. Well, Sega loyalists were pissed off that Sega did that. They just abandoned their fan base to support the Saturn. Again, prematurely. Normally what you do is you release a new home console, you keep making games for the last gen console. You don't just cold turkey stop making games. Well, that's what Sega did, but when they realized they fucked up, they immediately went back to making games for Genesis, but there was that period where they didn't have games in development. So Genesis gamers were like, fuck you, and left. They didn't bring in enough new Saturn gamers, but then when they cold turkey discontinued the Saturn, because it was costing them more money to sell the Saturn than they were to making off of it, because they were selling it at heavy losses because it was more expensive to manufacture than PlayStation, but they had to sell it at a loss to be competitive, and they weren't competitive. And so they just stopped making games for the Saturn and stopped selling Saturn so they could stop the bleeding, so they could restructure and prepare for the launch of the Dreamcast. Well, Saturn fans were pissed off that Sega did that. Same thing they did to the Genesis fans. Game over. And so, that's it. And so, they didn't buy the Dreamcast either. And that's why Sega failed. And that's all I have for today, or for right now. Stay cool.